This is Intersection. I'm Mathew Peddie. 4 former Minneapolis police officers have now been arrested and charged in the death of George Floyd. That comes after more than a week of nationwide protest over the killing of Floyd and other black Americans at the hands of police. So will those arrests change the dynamic of the protests? Well, joining Intersection to discuss the demonstrations, what led to them and the response is Dr. Eric Smaw, Associate Professor of Philosophy at Rollins College. Dr. Smaw, thank you so much for being with us.
Thank you, Matthew, for having me. It's a pleasure to be here.
We're also joined by Pastor Roderick Zach of Rejoice in the Lord Ministries. Pastor Zach, thank you so much as well.
Thank you for the invitation, Matt.
And you can join the conversation by sending in your questions and comments on Twitter. Are you joining those demonstrations? Are you moved to act in other ways? We want to hear from you. You can find us on Twitter at WMFE Orlando. Let me start by asking what both of you are thinking about as you witness the protests across this country. Pastor Zach, what's going through your mind?
Well, it is in response to, unfortunately, unlawful, brazen, merciless, atrocious killings, the killing of George Floyd. And unfortunately, this in the first instance, maybe probably the most stark. Mm-hmm. But and, so the protests are happening to bring attention to disparity, inequality, injustices, and just a historic problem that hasn't really been adequately dealt with yet. So I think it's highlighting things. Unfortunately, there are some players that are acting out, but protesters are not necessarily looters. And looters are looters. Mm-hmm. And protesters are protesters. So hopefully, we can get some handle on the criminality that's happening. But there's an outcry. Dr. Martin Luther King said that riot is the voice of the unheard, in essence. So I do understand it. I'm an African American male. I've been, unfortunately, harassed by the police myself, and so it's something that has to be done. And it's wonderful to see such a diverse crowd, that whites and Hispanics and Asians and African Americans, and it's just wonderful to see that happening. And I'm glad for that day that it's not, us, to use the term, crying in the wilderness. Mm-hmm. By ourselves, but more so there's a more united voice. If the powers that be can be sensitive and hear beyond just the outward demonstration of anger and get to the source of the problems.
Dr. Eric Smaw, what are you thinking about and thinking about, especially as you watch what's unfolding here in Central Florida, across the nation over the last few weeks, and these protests have been growing in strength and they don't seem to be going away?
So what's going through my mind is that African Americans have been the victims of police brutality and institutional oppression since the end of the Civil War. And many people, of course, thought that after the Civil Rights Movement, those things went away. But it turns out that police brutality has always been with us. It's just that after the Civil Rights Movement, the cameras went away. With the camcorders and the cell phones, we're able to record what's happening in black and brown communities and put it on social media like Facebook that didn't exist previously. Mm-hmm. And then with in-depth reporting, anybody can go onto the internet and see all of the institutional oppression that exists in our criminal justice system. So the first thing that's going through my mind is that this stuff has always been with us. It hasn't gone away. And the second thing that's going through my mind is that young people are demanding that we give them what we promised that we would give them, and that's a just society. And you see young people from all backgrounds demanding that we give them justice. And I think it's time that we stand up with them and demand of our politicians that they change the systems that have existed for a long time.
Here at WMFE, we've heard from a couple of listeners who draw comparisons between the demonstrations we're seeing now and the demonstrations that they took part in and witnessed in the 1960s. What do you make of that comparison, Dr. Smaw?
Okay, so I want to do two things with respect to the comparison of the demonstrations now and the demonstrations from the 1960s. The first is the protesters have been keen to draw a distinction between themselves and the people who have caused property damage. And then, of course, news outlets have reported that there are outside people coming into the protest and causing property damage. We saw that same tactic with the civil rights movement. There were people who attempted to infiltrate Dr. King's civil rights movement and then cause property damage for the purpose of denigrating the movement. So that's the first comparison that I want to draw. The second comparison that I want to draw is that there's nothing new about people who don't have democratic outlets for change or whose politicians have ignored them for years engaging in protests. And some of our most celebrated protests, we find that the protest often leads to property damage. Mm-hmm. The Boston Tea Party is a story about property damage. When we look at the Hong Kong protesters, we find that there's been over $600 million in property damage. And so although the protesters today aren't engaged in that, there are people from the outside coming in, if people aren't paid attention to, or if they don't have democratic means for making change, you will see their anger and frustration spill over into property damage.
Mm-hmm. Pastor Zach, your thoughts on the sort of comparisons between what we're seeing now and what we saw in the 60s?
Yeah, during the 60s, it was a more establishment-oriented, Christian-led movement. The whole process of mobilization was different. The focus on nonviolence was heavy, and there was even though it was still visceral, folks still angry. They were trained and it was a process prior to participating in the march. Here, you got the event of social media, this, concise communication that they're making. It's more grassroots. There's no really definitive leader. So it's a stark difference. And so hopefully some definitive leaders will be birthed from this in terms of some spokespersons that can lead the way to the process of solutions, strategies, tactics, a whole paradigm shift, and that's what's being called for. So I'm hoping and praying that that will be the next steps in this. But right now we see grieving and just a kind of righteous indignation, just bemoaning the injustice and the historical injustice. And coupled with the fact that we have a pandemic and huge numbers of people who are laid off, furloughed, terminated. So it's populated by, the last hired, the first fired, and those who are disenfranchised right now. So it's also, which shows for the huge numbers that we have here have to do with people being somewhat displaced, which even is maybe a displaced anger in addition to the anger that people are experiencing as a result of the injustice. So you got numerous things happening simultaneously here.
It is pretty complicated, right? I mean, we are sort of at this unique sort of junction of events, and in some ways, it's hard to step back and take a look and say, how do we get through this? I want to just throw out the Twitter handle again if you want to comment on the show. We are speaking with Pastor Roderick Zach and Dr. Eric Smaw, talking about police brutality and the events leading up to the protests, the death of George Floyd, and what may come out of these protests. Brandon writes in, make sure that you say the looters / violence isn't affiliated with the BLM protests, the Black Lives Matter protests. The looters are taking advantage of this time, but I also agree with John F. Kennedy. When peaceful revolution is ignored, violent revolution is inevitable. And I think that speaks a little bit, Pastor Zach, to what you were saying about the words of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. And one more comment here from Brandon. Our national anthem ends with the lyrics, "The land of the free and the home of the brave." When that first part isn't true, that second part needs to be. I believe there are actually some verses of the national anthem which we don't typically sing, which may say some other things as well. But I take your point. Thanks for writing in, Brandon. Eric Smaw, I just wonder, sort of, is this a moment where we all really need to sort of take a step and sort of reflect and say, okay, how do we get to this point?
Okay, so this is an excellent question. I want to take us back to 2006. The FBI published a report called the Intelligence Assessment Report, in which they told us that white supremacists have infiltrated our police departments in many cities throughout the country. This fact was reconfirmed by the Department of Homeland Security in the report called the Joint Intelligence Report. The Ku Klux Klan called their members who have infiltrated policing departments ghost Klansmen because they hold all of the traditional beliefs of Ku Klux Klansmen, but they don't act in traditional ways. So, for example, they don't wear the sheets and they don't use typical racist language. I call these people asymptomatic racists. At the extreme end of asymptomatic racism, you'll have Ku Klux Klansmen who have infiltrated policing departments, and that's where you get this brutalization of African Americans and Hispanic Americans in many cities throughout the country. You also get false arrests and unwarranted convictions of people, and hopefully I'll have a chance to talk about that later. But at the less extreme end of asymptomatic racism, you get people like Amy Cooper, who calls the police on Christian Cooper and issues a false report about him in Central Park. So to the question of how did we get here, there has been a process of moving, or at least a process from the Ku Klux Klansmen, of moving their members out of sheets and into policing departments so that they can act under the color of law. And even when they do things like we saw in Minnesota with George Floyd, they get the protection of qualified immunity, and therefore they don't end up in jail under most conditions.
Just sort of thinking about some of your comments there, Dr. Smaw, I wondered how you sort of balance that with, what we've seen, just thinking about here in Central Florida, but I think across the country as well. I mean, a lot of police chiefs and sheriffs have come out and said pretty emphatically, what happened to George Floyd was wrong. It was a crime. It should be prosecuted. The people who perpetrated it should be prosecuted. So how do you sort of balance those two things when you're talking about what you're calling the extreme end of asymptomatic racism, which is, you were saying, is kind of baked into some police departments? Like, how do those two things kind of measure up for you?
That's right.
Just mentioned. Go right ahead. Go ahead.
Okay, so
Dr. Smaw, if you wouldn't mind.
Go ahead.
Okay, that's right. It's not true that all police officers are racist, and it's most certainly not true that all police captains or all European Americans are racist. So, of course, there are many police officers who go to work every day, they do their jobs, and they try to do their jobs well. But on January 6th in 2015, the House of Representatives passed what's called H.R. 46. H.R. 46 tells us that in states like Texas, Kentucky, Alabama, Arkansas, and many other states, police officers were engaged in false arrest of African-American males. And then to ensure convictions, they would falsify evidence, fabricate evidence, intimidate witnesses, and so on. Those wrongful convictions have occurred all throughout this country. Now, most Americans will hear this and say, this is outrageous behavior. It most certainly can't be true. But when we look at exoneration statistics, we find that 60% of people who are exonerated for sexual assaults are African American, and 50% of people who are exonerated for murder are African American, and 55% of people who are exonerated for drug possession are African American. So we know that African Americans are being falsely arrested and wrongfully convicted at much higher rates than everyone else. But notice, no police officers go to jail for this. No prosecutors lose their job for this because of what I mentioned before, and that's qualified immunity. In fact, the movie Just Mercy gave us an excellent example of how this occurs.
Yeah. Let me just come to you real quick, Pastor Zach, before we go to a break, and your thoughts on the notion of what Dr. Smaw is referring to as asymptomatic racism, and sort of how far embedded that is into some of these institutions.
Unfortunately, the design of the fraternal order, of police. In other words, it's a type of fraternity, and unfortunately, they do protect each other. And you can understand why. But by the same token, there has to be more than just a self-review, self-examination, self-diagnosis in order to remedy the problem. There has to be a broader view, and unfortunately, the United States has been in the process of historically dehumanization of African Americans in a lot of ways, unfortunately, and we still see it, even in comments that are made from public officials, and so this dehumanization is a national crisis that can't be ignored any longer. There has to be value given to all life. And it's played out in a lot of different ways. A stereotypical depiction of African Americans as predominantly criminal, as predominantly uneducated, as predominantly violent, so forth and so on. So there's just this automatic predisposition in terms of what we're capable of, and so that has to be broken down. There has to be a renewed re-education and so forth to alleviate that. And the church needs to jump in. The predominantly white church needs to jump in and become moral brokers of what's right. Racism is not political. It's just wrong. It's immoral. And for them to be so solid and to say, in some instances, very little about racism and injustice and things of that nature, to be, in essence, Christian, politically correct in a Christian sense, that starts with them becoming a moral compass along with other institutions and agencies and so forth. It starts with that mindset being crushed.
More to talk about on the other side of this break. Do stay with us. Pastor Roderick Zach of Rejoice in the Lord Ministries and Eric Smaw, Associate Professor of Philosophy at Rollins College. You're listening to Intersection on 90.7 News. I'm Mathew Peddie. We'll be right back after this. You're listening to Intersection. I'm Mathew Peddie. We're discussing police brutality and racism, the nationwide demonstrations and the response to those demonstrations with Dr. Eric Smaw from Rollins College and Pastor Roderick Zach of Rejoice in the Lord Ministries. You can join the conversation by tweeting us your questions to @WMFE Orlando. Jennifer writes in, let's be clear also that although protesters during the civil rights movement were non-violent, it was a technique to provoke responses to demonstrate the violence of white supremacy. Pastor Zach, your thoughts on that? Does it seem like we're seeing some of that echoed now in these protests and these demonstrations?
You mean the infiltration? I'm sorry, could you rephrase the question?
So just to Jennifer's point about the fact that protesters during the civil rights movement were non-violent, that was a technique to provoke responses to demonstrate the violence of white supremacy. I'm just wondering if there's some echoes in what the civil rights protesters were aiming for in the 60s and what we're seeing now.
The protesters during the 60s, they had to be taught how to respond to violence against them. So that's unfortunately, we're seeing our own police officers disproportionately respond to these protesters, with full, army gear and tear gas and the concussion bomb, not the type of bombs. I'm not sure the title, but we see it all over the news. And a softer, a more, a different approach is what's needed right now. And these young people haven't been trained in terms of how to respond. I see them getting down on their knees periodically or laying down So that means some of them haven't. But there was a full regimen of instruction prior to going on a march. I went on a march in 1968, and I was a young man, and we received a full regimen of instruction prior to going on a march. And that's hit and miss with these protesters.
Here's another question from a listener. This kind of speaks to what we're talking about right now. At IW Mango, thanks for writing in. It writes, what are your opinions on the hashtag 8 can't wait policies, considering the history of the police? Is such policy just putting a Band-Aid on a bullet wound, so to speak? And I'm just looking at their website now. 8 can't wait. There are, according to this website, 8 policies that could decrease police violence by 72%. Some of those things are ban chokeholds and strangleholds, require de-escalation, require warning before shooting, exhaust all other means before shooting, and 4 others as well. So let me put that question to you, Eric Smaw. Are you familiar with this push and some of the policies therein?
Yes, I am. And I think that there are 2 types of changes we can make. Some of the changes are bold, and some of the changes are standard. So I'll start with the bold changes because I want to get those in. So, look, in 1967, the Supreme Court passed a doctrine called qualified immunity. Basically, what that means is that a police officer can be held liable for abusing you only if there is clearly established law against that abuse at the time in which it occurs. What this means is that if I get brutalized by a police officer, I have to look back into history to find a case with similar circumstances in which a police officer was prosecuted. Well, we can see that there are going to be 2 problems here. First, in the 1960s, police officers were not being prosecuted for brutalizing African Americans, so we're not going to have those cases established. But even if I can find a case, all a judge has to say is, well, the circumstances aren't similar. And though I recognize that your constitutional rights were violated, because I cannot meet the Supreme Court standard of clearly established law, you lose. And this, of course, has allowed police officers to act with impunity. So what can we do? The first thing all of us must do is write all of our congressmen and men and women and tell them to abolish qualified immunity, because it allows police officers to act with impunity. And then we need to establish a necessary standard. The necessary standard tells us some of the things that the people at Hate Can't Wait want. First, police officers must exhaust other remedies before they can act with violence. So no chokeholds, they have to look to de-escalate, and so on. A second thing that we could do is require a broad reading of the Fourth Amendment. Because the Supreme Court has so restricted the Fourth Amendment, that's also given police officers impunity to do what they will with us, and the Fourth Amendment can't protect us. So we need a broad reading of the Fourth Amendment. Those 2 things will take us a long way, in addition to things like banning chokeholds. So those are the broad changes I would argue for. Yeah,
and just to refresh the memory of our listeners and myself too, to be honest, the Fourth Amendment, the right of the people to be secure in their persons, houses, papers, and effects against unreasonable search and seizures shall not be violated. Some work to be done from the point of view of reform there. I want to get to another question and come back to something you were talking about before the break, Pastor Zach, and the role of the faith community in all of this as we sort of look to the future beyond these demonstrations. And I understand you're going to be walking tomorrow morning, Friday morning, as part of a walk of mourning and restoration. Talk to me a little bit about the walk and the purpose of it.
Well, the purpose of the walk is to in essence, grieve, to experience remorse, to lament, to think about the loss. And I think 400 names of persons who've been killed by police will be read off along with scriptures that talk about mourning, grieving, and then there'll be some apologies. Well, there'll be a testimony from some folks who have been abused, and then there'll be some apologies issued in terms of showing remorse by law enforcement, by some predominantly white religious leaders, to just say, hey, we could have done more. We could have been more sensitive. We could have instructed more. We could have not been insensitive to this issue in the past, and making a commitment to do better in the future. So prior to instituting action plans, strategies, considering best practices for reformation of the judicial system, of the criminal justice system, just taking a minute to feel this, to empathize, and that's what we do as a community. We mourn with those who mourn. We weep with those who weep, and then we get up from there, like a funeral, and from there we go forward and trying to strategize where we go from here. So it's a precursor to strategies for change.
Mm-hmm. And so just so I'm clear, you'll be walking alongside members of law enforcement who'll be sort of part of that process as well?
That's true. Christian leaders, judges, state's attorney, others are coming out to join us, along with a diverse cadre of Christian leaders, mm-hmm. both white and African American and Hispanic.
How much? Where do you, this is obviously part of a long process, but what do you see going forward? What do you think the next few months looks like, if it's even possible to sort of see that far out at this point?
Well, I think some think tanks are already developing that has some major people involved and developing like a task force that considers this from in a comprehensive way. And to innovate, to be creative in how we look at policing, and first try to analyze and take best practices and implement those, but also think about different ways that we can, for instance, we can electronically issue a ticket. Is it a way that we can? Some of our officers in our church said the most fearful experience they have is when they approach a vehicle. Is there a way that we can mitigate that? Is there a way that we can minimize approaching vehicles? Mm-hmm. It can't be apprehension at any cost. So is there a value system in the police system that says, okay, if you have a blank incident where you don't make an apprehension, do you get penalized for that? So how can we do policing that's more investigative, that's more involved in, waiting sometimes as opposed to jumping right in if it's a nonviolent scenario. Mm-hmm. And so those are the things that have to be considered. And voices and thinkers and sociologists and psychologists, have to come in and help the police department come up with a new paradigm, a new model that's more than them adjusting themselves. And mm-hmm. Hopefully government authorities will be involved in that, because they're supposed to be the overseers, and it's going to take some legislation, but it's going to take some local action, regional action to make a difference. And that's what we're going for in Orange County and the counties surrounding us in the Central Florida area. In the last
minute or so, and I'm afraid we're kind of running out of time here, but Dr. Eric Smaw, where do you see this conversation heading in the next month or so?
It's difficult to tell exactly where it'll go, because there are so many things going on at one time. So we have the protests going on, we have high rates of unemployment, and we also have COVID-19 still ongoing.
Right.
One thing that's true is that we don't have national leadership on this issue. So what I hope is that we'll have national leadership. I think that every single American can get out and vote at the national level, at the state level, and at local levels. And we can also require that our colleges and universities, our middle schools, elementary schools, and high schools teach American history that encompasses all people in America, and teach it openly and teach it honestly. Finally, the thing that I would add is that we can understand our protests for what they really are. They're cries out from the people for justice. Mm-hmm. And so while I don't expect my protesters to be perfect, I do expect their causes to be just. And if we can celebrate the justice in the civil rights movement, we can celebrate the justice now.
And we're going to have to leave it there, but I've been speaking with Dr. Eric Smaw from Rollins College and Pastor Roderick Zack of Rejoice in the Lord Ministries. I want to thank you very much both for joining us. And coming up next, coronavirus and hurricane season. We'll talk about how emergency managers are preparing and how Puerto Rico is bracing for an active season. That's when we return. Do stay with us.
Bye.